South Carolina is usually sold as a state of beach postcards, historic charm, golf course growth, and sleepy little towns where life moves at a gentler pace. This video is about the other South Carolina. 12 towns are slowly disappearing, and in many cases they have not found a real reason for people to come back. This is not just another generic list of bad towns, and it is not a cheap shot at small places that are already struggling. The question here is more specific. Which towns show the clearest signs of long-term retreat? Not just population loss on paper, but the kind of decline you can feel in a main street. You can feel it in a school system. You can see it in a mill site. You can see it along a railroad corridor, or in a business district that never got its second act. We are looking at places where the original purpose of the town has weakened, and the replacement never fully arrived. Along the way, we are going to see a town famous for a healing spring. Meanwhile, the rest of the community fights to stay visible. We will see a former railroad center that outlived the very system that built it. We will see a place shadowed by one of South Carolina's most expensive broken promises. And near the top of this list is a tiny town that feels less like a place in transition. It feels more like a place running out of time. To keep this fair, this ranking is not based on one crime number or one bad year. It is based on a broader pattern: population drift, loss of industry, shrinking services, weaker local momentum, and whether the town seems to be attracting a new generation in meaningful numbers. As always, no town is only its worst trend. If you like videos about the parts of America the brochures leave out, subscribe for more. Now, let's start with a place that still has a little bit of magic left in it. Number 12. Blackville. At first glance, Blackville seems like exactly the kind of small southern town that should be easier to save. It has a memorable name. It has an old town feel. And it has one of the strangest landmarks in the state. Healing Springs is a mineral spring that has drawn curiosity for generations. That is the contradiction. The town has a recognizable identity, but identity alone does not guarantee survival. Blackville sits in Barnwell County. It is far from the growth corridors that have transformed other parts of South Carolina. Its historic role was tied to rail, farming, and regional trade. Over time, those systems changed. Farms consolidated. Fewer people were needed to work the land. Younger residents left for larger job markets. And the local commercial base thinned out. What remains is a place with history, but not much economic gravity. The spring helps give Blackville a story. So does the railroad heritage. But a story is not the same thing as momentum. You can have a famous local curiosity and still struggle to keep storefronts full. You can still struggle to keep schools strong. And you can still struggle to keep families rooted. To be fair, towns like this can be more resilient than they look. Small populations can exaggerate decline, and community loyalty still matters. But Blackville feels like one of those places where the past is doing more work than the future. That is why it opens this list. Number 11. Ehrhardt. From the highway, Ehrhardt looks like the kind of town you could miss in a minute. A few blocks. Quiet streets. Scattered homes. And the feeling that most of the action left a long time ago. On paper, it has the ingredients of a classic rural South Carolina town. It grew out of agriculture, timber, and the local trade that once held together dozens of places across the state's interior. But the farm economy eventually needed fewer hands. Rural populations started thinning out. And Ehrhardt never found a replacement engine. That matters more than people realize. A town does not disappear all at once. First, it loses a store. Then, it loses a service. Then, it loses a reason for younger families to stay. Then, the school, the diner, the hardware place, or the doctor becomes a longer drive away. The map still says the town is there. Daily life says otherwise. What makes Ehrhardt memorable is precisely how quiet the decline feels. There is no giant skyline of abandoned industry here. There is no dramatic collapse. There is just a steady wearing down. That is often how disappearing towns actually fade. Not with one catastrophic event, but with a long series of small departures. The fair caveat is that not every tiny town needs to become a booming destination to survive. Some hold on for decades with modest expectations. But Ehrhardt represents a kind of rural erosion that is hard to reverse once it becomes the default pattern. Number 10. Branchville. Branchville has one of the strongest origin stories on this entire list. It was built by transportation. For a long time, that meant importance. Railroad lines converged here. The town developed around movement. And Branchville earned a place in South Carolina history that seems bigger than its current size. And that is exactly the problem. Branchville was shaped by a system that no longer gives it the same value. The first thing you notice is that this looks like a town that should matter more than it does. It has history. It has a real downtown footprint. It has an old railroad identity that still gives the place character. But highways eventually took over. Modern logistics patterns changed. Different regional hubs became more important. And Branchville became a place people passed near rather than passed through. That shift is brutal for a small town. When your importance depends on being a node and the network changes, you do not just lose traffic, you lose purpose. Its wildcard detail is also its most bittersweet one. Few small towns in South Carolina can tell a rail story as old and important as Branchville's. But heritage tourism rarely replaces the economic power that working transportation once brought. A museum story can preserve memory. It cannot fully restore payrolls. There is still pride here, and that should be said clearly. But Branchville feels like a textbook case of a town outliving the system that made it matter. Number 9. Denmark. Denmark is more complex than the towns below it. That is why it sits here and not higher. At first glance, a college town should have an advantage. Denmark has historic buildings. It has a recognizable name. And it has Voorhees University. That gives it a cultural and educational presence many small towns would love to have. But that advantage has not been enough to reverse the larger trajectory. A small college can stabilize a town culturally without truly transforming it economically. Students come and go. Faculty presence matters. Historic significance matters. But if the surrounding region is still losing people, the town's foundation remains fragile. If job creation stays thin, the town's foundation remains fragile. And if nearby bigger markets keep pulling residents outward, the town's foundation remains fragile. Denmark also carries the burden shared by many interior South Carolina communities. It is not close enough to a major growth boom to absorb spillover prosperity. And it is not unique enough in the market to draw large waves of newcomers on its own. That is the middle ground where a lot of towns slowly fade. Its memorable detail is the contrast itself. A place with educational history should feel like it is feeding the future. In Denmark, too often, it feels like the institution is holding the line. Meanwhile, the broader town struggles to keep up. To be fair, a college presence gives Denmark more life than some towns further up this countdown. But that is exactly why its inclusion matters. If even a college town cannot reliably pull people back in, the decline is not superficial. It is structural. We are only a third of the way in. And the pattern is already getting clearer. The next group is not just about quiet shrinkage. These are towns where old local importance has faded so visibly. You can almost trace the moment the momentum broke. Number 8. Bamberg. Bamberg has something a lot of disappearing towns do not. It has county seat status. On paper, that should help. The county seats usually keep a courthouse. They usually keep a few essential services. They usually maintain a little more foot traffic. And they give surrounding residents at least some reason to pass through. But county seat status is not the shield it used to be. The first thing you notice about Bamberg is that it still looks like a place built with confidence. There is civic architecture. There are older blocks that suggest a more active downtown. There is enough physical structure to remind you this was once a stronger local center. The contradiction is that the visual bones outlasted the economic muscle. Like much of this part of South Carolina, Bamberg was shaped by agriculture. It was shaped by small-scale trade, and it was shaped by the kind of local commerce that weakens when populations fall. Regional shopping also shifted elsewhere. More residents started traveling out of town for work. They traveled elsewhere for healthcare. They traveled elsewhere for retail. And they traveled elsewhere for services. Eventually, the town stopped functioning as a true hub. It started functioning more like a leftover one. What makes Bamberg stand out is how ordinary the process feels. This is not a spectacular collapse story. It is a slow deflation of regional importance. The courthouse remains. The old alignment remains. But the center of gravity has moved. The fair caveat is that county seats often hang on longer than people expect. Government functions matter. But hanging on is not the same thing as revival. Bamberg still has institutional relevance. It just does not have much evidence of a strong comeback. Number 7. Winnsboro. Winnsboro may be the prettiest contradiction on this list. At first glance, it looks like the kind of town preservationists dream about. Historic character. A dignified downtown. And a sense that the place still remembers when it mattered. And then you look deeper. For years, nearby hopes were tied not just to local charm. They were tied to bigger economic expectations in Fairfield County. Industry was supposed to provide a future. Energy development was supposed to anchor jobs and tax base. Instead, one of the most notorious broken promises in the state's recent history became part of the story. The failed VC Summer nuclear expansion became a symbol of how badly future planning can go wrong. That matters because towns like Winnsboro cannot afford many missed chances. When you are already fighting rural population loss, beauty is not enough. You need paychecks. You need confidence. And you need reasons for young families to stay. Its wildcard detail is that the town still carries a visual elegance many places would envy. That almost makes the decline feel harsher. A decaying mill village looks expected. A graceful county town losing relevance feels like a piece of the state's civic memory slipping away. To be fair, Winnsboro is not dead. Parts of Fairfield County still benefit from location advantages and regional access. But the town's long-term drift tells a bigger story. Charm can preserve a look, but it cannot by itself replace a lost economic future. If you are enjoying this countdown, hit like. Videos like this help surface the places that usually get skipped over. Number 6. Great Falls. Great Falls is one of the clearest examples in South Carolina of what happens when a town built around industrial power loses the industry. But the town keeps the shell. From the outside, the name sounds promising. The river is real. The setting is real. The hydroelectric history is real. And the textile history is real. And this was once a place with a serious reason to exist. But that is what makes the decline so visible. When the mills fade in a town like this, you do not just lose jobs. You lose identity. You lose routine. And you lose the center around which life was organized. The physical evidence is hard to ignore. In towns like Great Falls, empty mill structures do more than occupy land. They dominate the imagination. They remind everyone what the town used to be. And when those complexes are too large, too old, or too expensive to repurpose at scale, they become monuments. Monuments to payrolls that are not coming back. The town still has natural assets. It still has people who care. But that is not the same as having a development path strong enough to reverse decades of shrinkage. Great Falls is stuck in one of the most difficult positions a small town can face. It has a huge industrial legacy and a much smaller modern economy. The honest caveat is that river towns sometimes find new life through recreation. They sometimes find new life through heritage, and sometimes through niche redevelopment. But Great Falls has been waiting a long time for that second act. Right now, it feels more like a place surviving its past than building a new future. Number 5. Estill. Estill sits in the southern part of the state. It is closer to the Georgia line than to South Carolina's major growth story. That geography matters. At first glance, it looks like a working rural town with enough infrastructure to remain relevant. There are rail lines. There are older commercial buildings. There is a long agricultural history. And there is a position that once made sense in a more locally connected economy. But like several towns on this list, Estill was built for an earlier era. It was an era when small regional centers played a bigger role in everyday life. The contradiction is that it still looks like a service town, even as the service base has thinned. This part of South Carolina has long wrestled with poverty. It has wrestled with limited investment, and it has wrestled with educational and economic challenges that are hard to break once they become intergenerational. Estill is often mentioned as part of a broader rural belt. It is a place where opportunities are narrower, the distances are longer, and the recovery is slower. That does not mean the community lacks pride. It means the headwinds are persistent. Its memorable detail is not a single landmark. It is the isolation itself. In a booming coastal county, decline can be masked by nearby momentum. In a town like Estill, the lack of outside pull makes the shrinkage more exposed. And the caveat matters here. A place can be poor without disappearing, and small towns can stabilize at lower levels. But Estill feels like a town that has been asked to endure too much with too little. It remains standing. That is not the same as attracting people back. Number 4. Union. Union is bigger in history and footprint than several places we have already covered. That is why its decline feels so important. This is not just a crossroads town fading at the margins. Union was a real manufacturing place. It was a county seat, and it was part of the Textile South that once gave thousands of towns their economic backbone. The first impression is that it still has enough scale to recover. There are substantial buildings. There is a recognizable downtown. There is civic structure. But the deeper reality is that textile decline hit towns like Union with enormous force. And that force went beyond job loss. It weakened the whole local ecosystem around those jobs. When mills close or shrink, you do not just lose the people inside the plant. You lose spending at local stores. You lose stability for families. You lose tax base for schools. And you lose confidence for the next generation. Over time, that becomes cultural as much as economic. Young people stop imagining a future there. That may be the hardest loss of all. Union's wildcard is the size of its industrial memory. You can still feel that this was a place built to do more than it does now. That is what gives it emotional weight. To be fair, Union has more assets than some of the towns above it. There are still institutions, and efforts at stabilization do exist. But in this ranking, that almost makes the long-term fade more striking. Union is what it looks like when a once serious town keeps the frame, but loses the old engine. And now we reach the top 3. Here, the story changes again. These are not just towns that got quieter. These are places where population loss combines with weakened services. And fading opportunity makes the decline much harder to hide. We have moved from fragile towns to deeply diminished ones. The final 3 do not just show South Carolina's rural decline. They show what happens when a place loses people. Then it loses functions. And then it starts losing the expectation that it can recover. Number 3, Allendale. Allendale is one of those towns that forces you to separate beauty from momentum. There are older homes here. There are traces of civic pride. And there is enough local history to remind you that this was once a more active county center. But if you are measuring long-term viability, Allendale keeps landing on the hard side of the story. The town has spent years fighting the same cluster of problems that trap many struggling rural communities: population loss, persistent poverty, limited job creation, and difficulty maintaining essential services at the level residents need. When a county loses residents over time, everything gets harder. Healthcare gets harder. Education gets harder. Retail gets harder. Even the basic ability to sustain confidence gets harder. Allendale's deeper problem is not one dramatic event. It is accumulation. Decades of drift. Too few new employers. Too little regional pull. And too many reasons for younger residents to leave. Its memorable detail is that it still serves as a county seat, and it still carries educational significance through USC Salkehatchie nearby. That should help. And to some degree it does. But the fact that it has those institutional anchors and still struggles this much tells you something. The underlying challenge runs deep. The fair caveat is important. Statistics do not capture community spirit. And some residents see Allendale not as a lost cause. They see it as a place worth fighting for. That deserves respect. Even so, Allendale represents a town where the fight itself has become the main story. That is why it lands at number 3. If there is a South Carolina town on this list you know personally, let me know in the comments. Local perspective often tells the story numbers miss. Number 2, McColl. McColl feels like the kind of place where the silence says almost as much as the data. At first glance, you see the outline of a traditional small southern town. There is railroad history. There is old commercial space. There is nearby farmland. And there is the lingering shape of a community that once had a more secure place in the region. But McColl has been hit by the classic combination that drains small towns hardest: industrial retreat, population loss, and geographic isolation from the state's strongest growth zones. This is the kind of town where decline does not stay abstract. It shows up in buildings with no second use. It shows up in commercial spaces that do not refill. And it shows up in the sense that each generation has had to make a decision. Too many chose to leave. McColl's wild card is the sheer visual force of its leftovers. In towns like this, abandoned or underused industrial sites do more than signal lost work. They signal a broken local promise. People built lives around those employers. Once they were gone, the town did not have a backup plan of equal scale. The honest caveat is that McColl still has residents who care deeply about the place. And not every quiet town is a dead town. But few places in South Carolina so clearly communicate the feeling of being bypassed. Not by one road, but by the entire direction of modern growth. That is why it reaches number 2. Which brings us back to the strongest open loop from the beginning. The tiny town that feels less like it is waiting for revival, and more like it is waiting for an ending. Number 1. Carlisle. Carlisle is the clearest example on this list because it strips the whole story down to its essentials. This is not a town with a beautiful downtown still hanging on to false hope. It is not a place with a college. It is not a place with a courthouse center. And it does not have a large industrial footprint to cushion the fall. Carlisle represents the end stage. From the highway, it looks like the kind of place that survives mostly because it has not yet officially disappeared. That may sound harsh, but it captures the reality. Carlisle is tiny. It is deeply diminished. And it is missing the kinds of institutions that help other small towns slow the slide. When a place gets this small, decline becomes self-reinforcing. Fewer people means fewer services. Fewer services mean less reason to stay. And less reason to stay means fewer people. Its history, like so many towns in this part of the South, was tied to an earlier local economy. That economy no longer works the way it used to. Agriculture changed. Transportation changed. Regional commerce changed. And Carlisle never found a new identity strong enough to reverse the drift. The wildcard detail here is almost the absence of one. That is what makes Carlisle so powerful as a number 1. There is no giant tourist draw. There is no major institution. And there is no dramatic redevelopment storyline waiting in the wings. The town's story is simpler and harder. When the original reason for a place disappears, some towns shrink. Eventually, the place name survives better than the place itself. To be fair, even here, there is still human dignity. People live there. People maintain ties there. The map matters because lives matter. But if this countdown is about which South Carolina town most completely represents slow disappearance without a convincing return path, Carlisle deserves the top spot. That is why Carlisle is number 1. Not because it has the largest building, not because it has the worst single statistic, and not because it has the most famous collapse. It is number 1 because it shows the whole theme of this video in its purest form. A town can remain legally alive long after its economic purpose has faded. Its population strength can fade, and its future pull can mostly disappear. And that is really what this entire list reveals. South Carolina's disappearing towns are not random accidents. Most of them were built for a specific economic era: rail junctions, mill payrolls, courthouse trade, farm labor, and small regional retail. When those systems changed, some towns adapted. Others never got a real second act. That does not mean these places are worthless. It does not mean the people there do not care. And it does not mean every small town in South Carolina is doomed. What it does mean is that the postcard version of the state leaves out a lot. Behind the beaches are quieter places. Behind the booming suburbs are quieter places. Behind the fast-growing corridors is a quieter map. It is a map of places still waiting for investment, places waiting for replacement industry, or simply waiting for a reason for the next generation to stay. So now I want to hear from you. Which town on this list surprised you most? And which South Carolina town should be in a part 2? If you want more videos about forgotten towns, hidden history, and the parts of America most people drive past, subscribe. And until next time, keep looking beyond the brochure.